They called it the Schwalbe, the Swallow. At 540 miles per hour, the Messerschmitt Me 262 was faster than anything the RAF had ever encountered. 4 30mm cannons, jet engines, untouchable. When the first reports arrived at Fighter Command headquarters in Bentley Priory on a freezing November morning in 1944, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory dismissed them as impossible. But within 72 hours, 3 Spitfire squadrons had been obliterated over the Rhine, their wreckage scattered across frozen German fields. The jets were real, and Britain had absolutely no idea how to stop them. November 8, 1944. 07:23 hours, RAF Bentley Priory, Stanmore, Middlesex. The operations room smelled of cigarette smoke, stale tea, and damp wool. Rain hammered against blacked-out windows as squadron leaders hunched over plotting tables, tracking bomber formations returning from overnight raids on the Ruhr. The worn linoleum floor bore scuff marks from 3 years of constant footfall. Radiators clanked feebly against the November cold. Wing Commander James Harcourt, 34, originally from Folkestone, stood reviewing combat reports with mounting disbelief. His hands trembled slightly. Not from cold, but from what he was reading. 3 separate Spitfire Mannheim squadrons had engaged unidentified aircraft over Osnabrück at 8 hours the previous morning. The reports were identical in their impossibility. Enemy aircraft moving at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, accelerating away from pursuing Spitfires as though the British fighters were stationary. No propellers visible, exhaust trails unlike anything recorded. "Sir, with respect, these pilots are exhausted," offered Squadron Leader Peters, gesturing at the documents with his pipe. "They've been flying continuous operations for 18 days. Fatigue does strange things to perception." Harcourt shook his head. 27 pilots from 3 different squadrons reporting identical characteristics. Flight Lieutenant Morrison was one of them. He's got 200 operational hours and a DFC. He doesn't imagine things. The statistical reality was devastating. In that single engagement, the RAF had lost 14 Spitfires with 11 pilots killed. Not a single enemy aircraft had been damaged. The kill ratio wasn't just unfavorable, it was catastrophic. For every 10 British fighters engaging these unknown aircraft, 7 were destroyed without landing a single effective shot. The operational problem was existential. Fighter Command's entire defensive strategy depended on Spitfires maintaining air superiority over German formations. The Spitfire Mk9 could reach 408 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to intercept any known Luftwaffe aircraft. Messerschmitt Bf-109s maxed out at 386 mph. Focke-Wulf FW-190s reached 426 mph. British fighters could catch them, engage them, force combat on favorable terms. But if the Luftwaffe now possessed aircraft capable of 540 miles per hour, every tactical assumption collapsed. Spitfires couldn't intercept them, couldn't chase them, couldn't force engagement. The jets could choose when and where to attack, strike with devastating firepower, then accelerate away before British fighters could respond. Bomber formations would be massacred, escort fighters rendered useless. By November 10th, intelligence reports confirmed the impossible. The Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe was operational. Twin Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines producing 1,180 pounds of thrust each. Maximum speed 540 mph. Armed with 4 Mk108 30mm cannons mounted in the nose, each firing 650 rounds per minute. A single burst could disintegrate a Spitfire. The strategic implications terrified Fighter Command. Germany had achieved technological breakthrough that fundamentally altered aerial warfare. If Me 262 production scaled up, Allied bomber campaigns would become suicidal. Daylight raids would cease. The entire strategic bombing offensive, Britain's primary method of striking German industrial capacity, would collapse. Wing Commander Harcourt attended an emergency briefing at Bentley Priory on November 12th. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, looking older than his 62 years, addressed 30 senior officers in the Underground Operations Centre. Maps covered every wall. Cigarette smoke hung in thick layers beneath fluorescent lights. "Gentlemen, we are facing the first operational jet fighter in history," Dowding said, his voice carrying the flat exhaustion of 4 years commanding Britain's aerial defense. "Our intelligence estimates suggest the Luftwaffe currently has 40 to 60 operational Me-262s. If Germany produces 200, our bomber offensive ends. If they produce 500, we lose air superiority over France. If they produce 1,000, we cannot defend British airspace." The room fell silent except for the muffled clatter of teleprinters. "Our Spitfires cannot catch them in level flight. Our Tempests cannot catch them. The Americans' P-51 Mustangs cannot catch them. Conventional interception tactics are worthless." Dowding paused, letting the implications settle. "We need solutions. We need them immediately. And we need them from people willing to think beyond established doctrine." Harcourt felt something shift in his chest, not fear, but recognition. This was the moment where orthodoxy had failed and improvisation became survival. Britain had faced this before. In 1940, when invasion seemed inevitable. In 1941, when U-boats nearly starved the island. In 1942, when Singapore fell and empire crumbled. Each time the response had been the same: stubborn refusal to accept defeat, combined with creative desperation. That afternoon, Harcourt received orders transferring him to a newly formed tactical research unit at RAF Wittering in Cambridgeshire. His assignment: develop operational methods to counter the Me-262 threat using existing aircraft and resources. He was given 3 Spitfire squadrons, 2 months, and access to whatever intelligence could be gathered from combat reports and captured German documents. The unit assembled on November 15th in a freezing Nissen hut that smelled of engine oil and mildew. 14 pilots, 6 intelligence analysts, 3 aeronautical engineers, average age 26. None had worked together before. Most were skeptical that any solution existed. Flight Lieutenant David Morrison, 28, from Liverpool, stood near the coal stove, nursing tea in a chipped mug. He'd survived the Osnabrück engagement by pure luck. His Spitfire had been in a climbing turn when the Me-262 flashed past, cannons silent. He'd watched it accelerate away, its twin exhaust trails impossibly bright against grey clouds. "We can't outrun them. Can't outclimb them, can't outturn them at high speed," Morrison said, his Scouse accent flat with exhaustion. "So what exactly are we supposed to do? Throw rocks?" Harcourt spread reconnaissance photographs across a battered wooden table. The images showed Me-262s on airfields near Munich, Lechfeld and Brandenburg. One photo captured a jet during takeoff, landing gear retracting, exhaust trails visible. "We can't match their speed," Harcourt agreed. "But speed isn't everything. These aircraft are complex. They require specialized maintenance, trained pilots, specific fuel. They're vulnerable during takeoff and landing when they're slow, and they have operational limitations we don't fully understand yet." "You want us to loiter near their airfields?" asked Squadron Leader Patricia Thornton, 32, one of the few women granted operational flying status after tireless campaigning. "We'd be massacred by flak before we got within 5 miles. Not loiter, predict." Harcourt tapped a map showing known Me-262 bases and recent engagement locations. "They're being deployed against our bomber streams. That means they're following predictable patrol patterns. If we can identify those patterns, we can position ourselves where they're vulnerable, climbing to altitude, low on fuel, distracted by bomber targets." The strategy was brutally simple. Exploit the moments when jet superiority meant nothing. A Me-262 accelerating through 250 mph during takeoff was no faster than a Spitfire in a dive. A jet returning to base, fuel tanks nearly empty, couldn't afford extended combat. A pilot focused on lining up a bomber for his cannon run might not see the Spitfire diving from 8,000 feet above. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't fair. It was acknowledgement that technological inferiority demanded tactical creativity. Britain couldn't build jets to match Germany's, not in time to matter. British industry was exhausted, resources stretched impossibly thin. Factories operated under blackout conditions, workers subsisting on rations, constant bombing raids disrupting production. So they would use what they had: experienced pilots, reliable aircraft, and 5 years of bitter lessons about how determination could compensate for disadvantage. The first operational trial was scheduled for November 22nd over the Rhine Valley. 3 Spitfire squadrons would position themselves along known Me-262 approach routes to bomber formations. They would attack only when conditions favored them: altitude advantage, sun position, element of surprise. If jets appeared with superior positioning, British fighters would disengage immediately. It violated every instinct trained into fighter command pilots. For 4 years, they'd been taught to press attacks, maintain engagement, force decisive combat. Now they were being ordered to choose their battles with cold calculation, accepting that survival mattered more than glory. The night before the operation, Harcourt walked the flight line at RAF Wittering. 27 Spitfires sat in revetments, their fabric-covered rudders snapping in bitter wind. Ground crews worked under shielded lamps, checking magnetos and gun synchronization. Frost formed on wings. He thought about the 14 pilots lost at Osnabrück, thought about the bomber crews who would die if Me-262s couldn't be countered, thought about the grinding exhaustion of a nation that had been fighting for 5 years and couldn't afford to lose now. Somewhere over Germany, Me-262s sat in hardened shelters, fueled and armed. Their pilots, young Luftwaffe officers who'd grown up in Hitler's Reich, believed their jets made them invincible. Tomorrow, Harcourt intended to prove them wrong. November 22nd, 1944, 09:47 hours, 18,000 feet above Cologne. The cold at altitude was savage. Flight Lieutenant Morrison's oxygen mask frosted with each breath, the rubber stiff against his face. His Spitfire vibrated steadily, Merlin engine droning, propeller tips leaving vortex trails in thin air. Below, the Rhine curved through industrial haze. Cologne's shattered cathedral barely visible through smoke from overnight RAF bombing. Morrison led Red Section. 3 Spitfires positioned 5,000 feet above the expected approach route of American B-17 formations, heading for synthetic oil refineries at Leuna. Intelligence estimated Me-262s would attempt interception somewhere between Bonn and Kassel. The Spitfires had been circling for 40 minutes, fuel gauges dropping steadily. Red Leader, this is Red 3. Fuel state critical in 15 minutes. Morrison checked his own gauge. Same situation. The tactical problem was immediate. Remain on station and risk running dry, or abort and leave bomber crews undefended. This was the reality of operations in late 1944. Every decision involved choosing between bad options and worse ones. Acknowledged, Red 3. We'll give it 10 more minutes, then... Contact! 11 o'clock low, 3 aircraft, jet exhaust visible. Morrison's head snapped left there. 12,000 feet below, 3 Me-262s in loose formation, accelerating toward the B-17 stream. Unmistakable twin exhaust trails, swept wings, predatory shape. They were climbing, trading speed for altitude, positioning for attack runs on the bombers. This was the moment Harcourt's entire strategy depended on. Catching jets when they were committed to an attack profile, focused on bomber targets, climbing through speeds where Spitfires still held advantage. Red Section attacking now. Full throttle dive attack, single pass only. Do not pursue if they accelerate away. Morrison pushed the stick forward. The Spitfire's nose dropped, engine howl rising to a scream as airspeed built rapidly. 300 mph, 350, 380. Altimeter unwinding like a broken watch. The Me-262s grew larger in his gun sight. Closer, closer. The lead German pilot spotted them late. Morrison saw the jet's wings rock as the pilot reacted, beginning a hard right turn. But the Me-262 was climbing through 280 mastisups, and its turn rate at that speed was sluggish. The Spitfire, diving at 420 km with altitude advantage, was inside the jet's turn radius. Morrison opened fire at 400 yards. 8 303 Browning machine guns converged, tracers forming a glowing stream. He walked the rounds across the Me-262's fuselage, seeing bright sparks where bullets struck metal. The jet's right engine erupted in flame, not burning steadily but violently, white-hot fire streaming back over the wing. The German pilot reacted instantly, rolling inverted and diving. But the damaged engine was losing power catastrophically. Morrison didn't pursue. He pulled out of the dive at 8,000 feet, throttle back, searching for the other two Me-262s. They were gone, accelerated away the moment the attack began, vanishing into haze at speeds Morrison's Spitfire couldn't match. But the damaged jet was falling, trailing smoke and fire, its pilot fighting for control. At 4,000 feet, the canopy blew free. Morrison saw the pilot's parachute deploy, white silk against grey industrial landscape. The Me-262 impacted in a field northeast of Cologne, fireball visible from 6 miles away. Red leader to red section, disengage, form up and return to base. The flight back to Wittering took 90 minutes. Morrison landed with fuel gauges, showing 20 gallons remaining, roughly 10 minutes of flight time. The other two Spitfires landed with even less. One pilot's engine coughed on final approach, propeller windmilling as fuel starvation killed the Merlin. In the debriefing hut, intelligence officers recorded every detail. The Me-262's vulnerability during climb-out, the effectiveness of altitude advantage and surprise, the critical importance of disengaging immediately rather than pursuing, the fact that damaged jets couldn't simply accelerate away. Their advantage disappeared when engines failed. Wing Commander Harcourt studied the combat film from Morrison's gun camera. The footage was grainy, black and white, but undeniable. A Me-262, technological pinnacle of German engineering, falling in flames after a conventional fighter armed with 50-year-old machine gun technology exploited 30 seconds of tactical vulnerability. One kill confirmed, Harcourt said quietly, but the other two escaped. They'll file reports. The Luftwaffe will adjust their tactics. We've got perhaps 2 weeks before they start escorting their jets with conventional fighters or change their approach patterns. Over the next 14 days, RAF pilots flew 247 sorties specifically targeting Me-262 operations. They shot down 6 jets, damaged 11 more, and forced 17 to abort attacks on bomber formations. But the cost was brutal. 23 Spitfires lost, 19 pilots killed, 4 captured. The operational reality was stark. Even with tactical advantages, engaging Me-262s remained desperately dangerous. German pilots learned to check their 6 o'clock obsessively during climb-out. They began flying approach patterns at higher speeds, accepting worse firing solutions against bombers in exchange for safety from Spitfire interception. Some bases deployed FW-190s to fly cover during Me-262 takeoff and landing windows. By December 10th, Harcourt's unit had compiled detailed operational data. The average Me-262 engagement lasted between 90 and 120 seconds from first visual contact to disengagement. British pilots had to achieve decisive results in that window or abort. Fuel consumption during high-speed intercepts was catastrophic. Spitfires often returned with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining. The human cost was equally harsh. Flight Lieutenant Morrison flew 23 operational sorties between November 22nd and December 18th. He lost 11 kilograms of body weight, developed chronic insomnia, started drinking 3 fingers of whiskey every night just to sleep 4 hours. His hands shook constantly from fatigue and adrenaline overload. Squadron leader Thornton flew 16 sorties, including one where her Spitfire took cannon fire from a Me-262 she'd been stalking. The 30mm shells, each weighing nearly half a kilogram, struck her port wing, shearing off the outer section and destroying the aileron. She'd nursed the crippled aircraft back to Wittering, flying with rudder and throttle alone. landing at 140 mph because she couldn't slow down without stalling. The Spitfire was written off. Thornton was flying again 2 days later in a replacement aircraft. This was the reality Harcourt had known was coming. Winning through attrition and exhaustion, accepting horrific costs because the alternative was losing entirely. Britain in late 1944 was running on fumes. Industrial capacity stretched beyond sustainability, population worn down by 5 years of rationing and bombing, military resources committed on 3 continents simultaneously. But the strategy was working. Me-262 effectiveness against bomber formations dropped 34% in December compared to November. The Luftwaffe pulled jets back from some operational areas, redeploying them to defend oil refineries and aircraft factories, targets where the risk of interception had to be accepted. German operational reports, captured when the Wehrmacht abandoned forward headquarters during Allied advances, showed increasing concern. One document from Jagdgeschwader 7, dated December 15th, noted, Me-262 losses during takeoff and landing phases are becoming unsustainable. Enemy fighters are predicting our patrol patterns with disturbing accuracy. Pilot morale is declining. That last line revealed something profound. The Me-262 pilots, young men in their early 20s who'd grown up believing German technological superiority was absolute, were learning that technology alone didn't guarantee victory. They were being hunted by obsolete propeller-driven fighters using nothing more sophisticated than altitude, surprise, and cold tactical patience. On December 23rd, Harcourt received orders to expand the program. 8 additional Spitfire squadrons would be trained in anti-jet tactics. The operational manual he'd written, Tactical Methods for Engaging High-Speed Enemy Aircraft, would be distributed to every RAF fighter station. American P-51 squadrons requested copies to develop their own procedures. That night in the officers' mess at Wittering, Morrison sat by the fire, nursing weak beer. Outside, snow fell steadily, covering the airfield in white silence. Tomorrow he'd fly his 31st operational sortie. His chances of surviving to sortie number 50 were, according to actuarial analysis, roughly 1 in 4. "Think we're making a difference?" asked Flying Officer Davies, 22, who joined the unit 3 weeks earlier. Morrison stared into the fire. "We're keeping them afraid. That's all we can do. Make them check behind before they commit. Force them to second-guess every approach. Ensure they never feel safe, even when they're faster." He took a long drink. "That's how you beat technological advantage. Make it irrelevant by attacking where it doesn't matter." It was, in its way, a very British approach to warfare. Stubborn refusal to accept defeat, combined with ruthless exploitation of enemy weakness, wrapped in grim humor about the absurdity of fighting jets with propeller planes. Outside, ground crews prepared aircraft for tomorrow's operations. Engines were checked, ammunition belts loaded, fuel tanks topped up. The work continued in freezing darkness because stopping meant dying, and Britain had been at war too long to consider that option. January 7th, 1945, Jagdgeschwader 7 Headquarters, Brandenburg-Brest Airfield. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, 31, stood in operations reviewing loss reports with growing frustration. Outside, mechanics worked on Me-262s in conditions that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Allied bombing had destroyed heated hangars, forcing maintenance in open revetments where January cold made metal brittle and fuel viscous. Steinhoff commanded one of Germany's premier jet fighter units. His pilots were experienced, well-trained, flying aircraft that should have dominated every engagement. Yet the loss rate was climbing. In December alone, Jagdgeschwader 7 had lost 19 Me-262s, 11 in combat, 8 to mechanical failures. Pilot casualties, 14 killed, 7 wounded, 3 captured after bailing out over enemy territory. The operational reports revealed a disturbing pattern. Most combat losses occurred during climb-out to attack altitude or return approaches to base. Enemy fighters, specifically British Spitfires and American P-51s, were positioning themselves along known patrol routes, waiting at high altitude, attacking when Me-262s were most vulnerable. "They're predicting our operations," Steinhoff told his senior officers during the morning briefing. "They know our bases, our typical patrol altitudes, our approach patterns to bomber formations. They're exploiting the 30 seconds when we're climbing through 250 to 350 miles per hour before we can accelerate beyond their interception capability." Hauptmann Georg Peter Eder, one of the unit's most experienced pilots with 42 kills, gestured at the tactical map. "We could randomize approach vectors, vary our climb-out patterns, maintain higher speeds during approach." "At what cost?" Steinhoff countered. "Higher approach speeds mean worse firing solutions against bombers. Varied climb patterns increase fuel consumption. We're already operating at maximum sortie rates with minimum reserves. Every tactical adjustment reduces our effectiveness against primary targets." This was Germany's fundamental problem in early 1945, resource exhaustion forcing impossible choices. The Me-262 was technologically superior, but it consumed 2,570 litres of fuel per mission compared to 100 litres for a Bf-109. It required specialised J-2 fuel, which was in desperately short supply, because Allied bombing had devastated synthetic fuel production. Each jet needed 16 hours of maintenance per flight hour, performed by mechanics who were overworked, underfed, and increasingly aware that Germany was losing the war. Steinhoff walked the flight line after the briefing. 6 Me-262s sat ready for operations, but 8 more were grounded for maintenance. One had cracked turbine blades. Replacement parts were somewhere in Bavaria, delayed because Allied fighters controlled the railways. Another had hydraulic failure. The repair required fluid that hadn't arrived from the factory in 2 weeks. The pilots were exhausted. They flew 3, sometimes 4 sorties per day, then spent evenings in bunkers while RAF bombers pounded the airfield. Food was scarce. Breakfast was usually ersatz coffee and black bread. Dinner, a thin soup with occasional meat. Morale was maintained through collective denial. Nobody spoke openly about the strategic situation, about Soviet armies advancing from the east, about American forces crossing the Rhine. But everyone knew. The maps told the story. German-held territory shrinking daily, supply lines collapsing, industrial production falling catastrophically. On January 10th, Steinhoff led a swarm, 4 Me-262s, on an interception mission against American B-17s bombing oil refineries at Magdeburg. The jets climbed to 6,000 meters, leveled off, began their approach to the bomber stream. Steinhoff spotted the Spitfires at the last possible moment. 4 fighters diving from 8,000 meters, sun behind them, closing at impossible speed. He barely had time to shout a warning before machine gun fire stitched across his wingman's aircraft. The Me-262's left engine exploded, flames spreading instantly. Steinhoff rammed throttles forward, jet engines screaming as acceleration built. The Spitfires couldn't match his speed, but they didn't need to. His wingman was going down, pilot fighting to keep control long enough to bail out. The other 2 Me-262s scattered, mission aborted, bomber stream unmolested. Flying back to Brandenburg, Steinhoff conducted brutal mental arithmetic. 4 jets launched, 1 destroyed, 3 driven off without achieving any results. Cost: 1 aircraft lost, approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks, 1 pilot killed, 10,280 litres of scarce J-2 fuel consumed, maintenance hours for 3 jets recovering from emergency acceleration. Benefit: 0. Bomber formations continued unimpeded. This happened repeatedly throughout January. Me-262 units would scramble to intercept bomber streams, only to be bounced by Allied fighters waiting at altitude. Sometimes the jets got through and devastated bomber formations with their heavy cannons. But increasingly, Allied fighters forced them to abort, disengage, or fight through intercepts that consumed time and fuel. German intelligence analyzed the tactical situation in a report dated January 18th. The analysis was damning. Enemy forces have developed effective countermeasures, exploiting Me-262 operational vulnerabilities. Their fighters concentrate near known Me-262 bases, maintain altitude advantage, and attack during climb-out and approach phases when our aircraft cannot exploit speed advantage. Unless operational security can be restored or bases relocated, current loss rates are unsustainable. But relocating bases was nearly impossible. Me-262s required concrete runways at least 2,500 meters long, far longer than Bf-109s or FW-190s needed. Building such runways took months and enormous resources. Existing bases were known to Allied intelligence, their locations plotted, their operational patterns studied. Steinhoff watched younger pilots, boys of 19 or 20, rush through training because experienced pilots were dead, struggling to master jet aircraft that were extraordinarily unforgiving. The Jumo 004 engines flamed out if throttle was advanced too quickly. Compressor stalls killed you at low altitude. Landing speeds were 30 mph faster than conventional fighters. One pilot overshot the runway, couldn't stop, cartwheeled through trees at the airfield's end, dead instantly. By late January, the psychological advantage had shifted. Me-262 pilots no longer felt invincible. They checked their 6 obsessively aborted attacks when Allied fighters appeared above them, returned to base burning excess fuel in emergency power settings just to reduce vulnerable flight time. On January 28th, Steinhoff attended a conference at Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin. The city was being bombed nightly, rubble streets cordoned off, Hitler Youth manning flak batteries. The conference room, deep underground in a bunker complex, was cold, damp, lit by flickering electric lights running off emergency generators. The statistics presented were catastrophic. Me-262 production had peaked at 200 aircraft per month in November 1944. By January 1945, production had dropped to 70 aircraft monthly. Allied bombing of component factories had destroyed supply chains. Fuel production was down 70% from peak capacity. Pilot training programs were graduating students with 60 hours total flight time, compared to 240 hours in 1942. The operational reality was inescapable. Germany had achieved extraordinary technological breakthrough, but lacked the industrial capacity, resources, and strategic depth to exploit it decisively. The Me-262 was magnificent and irrelevant because there weren't enough of them. They couldn't be properly maintained, pilots couldn't be adequately trained, and Allied forces had developed tactical counters that exploited the narrow windows where jet superiority meant nothing. A Luftwaffe general, Steinhoff didn't recognize him, delivered the final assessment. "We are losing the resource war. The enemy produces 5,000 aircraft monthly to our 500. They train pilots for 8 months. We train them for 8 weeks. They have unlimited fuel. We ration every liter. Technology cannot compensate for this disparity. The Me-262 is extraordinary, but it's extraordinarily too late." Steinhoff flew back to Brandenburg in a Ju-52 transport, cramped in the fuselage with 20 other officers. Below, Germany passed in frozen grey desolation, bombed cities, destroyed rail lines, refugees clogging roads. The industrial heartland that had sustained 6 years of war was collapsing. At Brandenburg that night, mechanics worked on Me-262s by lantern light because electrical power was rationed. Pilots huddled in billets heated by scrounged wood because coal allocations had been cut again. Outside, Soviet artillery rumbled in the distance, 150 kilometers away, closing steadily. Steinhoff stood watching mechanics replace turbine blades by hand, delicate work performed in sub-zero temperatures by men who hadn't eaten properly in weeks. He thought about the British and American pilots who developed tactics to hunt his jets. Thought about how they'd studied German patterns, identified vulnerabilities, exploited weaknesses with methodical patience. It was, he realized, a typically British approach. Use what you have, make the enemy's strength irrelevant, grind them down through persistence. The RAF couldn't build jets to match Me-262s, so they'd simply refuse to fight on terms where jets held advantage. Tomorrow he'd fly again, knowing Allied fighters would be waiting somewhere along his route, positioned perfectly to attack when his jet was most vulnerable. The technological marvel that should have changed aerial warfare had become just another weapon in a war Germany was losing through exhaustion. May 8, 1945. RAF Wittering, Cambridgeshire. Wing Commander James Harcourt stood on the airfield watching Spitfires return from their final operational sorties. The war in Europe had ended at midnight. Churchill's voice had crackled over wireless sets announcing unconditional German surrender. Across Britain, celebrations erupted. Church bells ringing for the first time in 5 years, bonfires lit despite blackout regulations finally lifted. But at Wittering, the mood was subdued. Exhausted pilots climbed from cockpits after flying armed patrols, ensuring German forces actually complied with surrender terms. Ground crews performed maintenance from habit, unable to accept that the operational tempo that had governed their lives for 5 years had simply stopped. Harcourt held a statistical report compiled by RAF intelligence. The numbers told the story of 6 months fighting Me-262s with obsolete aircraft and improvised tactics. Between November 1944 and May 1945, British and American fighters had destroyed 237 Me-262s in aerial combat, most during takeoff, landing or climb-out phases when jets couldn't exploit speed advantage. Another 189 had been destroyed on the ground during airfield attacks. German records indicated 478 additional Me-262s lost to mechanical failures, fuel shortages, or pilot error. Total Me-262 production, approximately 1,400 aircraft. Of those, fewer than 200 had been operational simultaneously at peak strength. The vaunted jet fighter force that should have swept Allied bombers from German skies had been strangled by resource exhaustion, tactical countermeasures, and industrial collapse. Allied bomber losses had dropped significantly once anti-jet tactics became standard. In October 1944, before systematic counter-Me-262 operations, bomber loss rates averaged 4.7% per mission. By March 1945, that had fallen to 1.9%. The difference represented thousands of aircrew lives saved, but the cost had been severe. RAF anti-jet operations had lost 283 fighters, with 217 pilots killed. Average pilot life expectancy in dedicated anti-jet squadrons was approximately 43 operational sorties, lower than the already brutal statistics for conventional fighter operations. Flight Lieutenant Morrison had survived 71 sorties. He'd shot down 2 Me-262s confirmed, damaged 4 others, and forced 17 to abort attacks. He weighed 58 kilograms, down from 73 when he'd started operations in November. His service medical record noted chronic fatigue, symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress, and recommendation for extended leave. Squadron leader Thornton had flown 63 sorties, destroyed 1 Me-262, and been shot down twice, once by flak, once by a jet's defensive fire. She'd bailed out over Belgium, been sheltered by resistance fighters, and returned to operations 2 weeks later. Her post-war assignment, training new RAF pilots in tactical doctrine developed during anti-jet operations. The tactical manual Harcourt had written, initially distributed to 8 squadrons, had been translated into 4 languages and become standard doctrine for Allied air forces. American fighter groups credited the tactics with destroying 147 Me-262s over Germany between January and April 1945. On May 10th, Harcourt toured captured German airfields in Bavaria with Allied intelligence teams. Brandenburg-Brest was abandoned, its runways cratered by demolition charges, Me-262s destroyed by retreating Luftwaffe personnel. At Lechfeld, they found 34 Me-262s sitting intact, beautiful machines with swept wings and streamlined fuselages, abandoned because there was no fuel to fly them, no ammunition for their cannons, no pilots to operate them. Harcourt climbed into one Me-262's cockpit. The instruments were elegant, controls sophisticated, engineering magnificent. This aircraft represented pinnacle of aeronautical design in 1945, and it had been rendered strategically irrelevant by Spitfires, altitude advantage, and patient tactical discipline. RAF technical teams dismantled Me-262s for study. British aviation companies analysed the Jumo 004 engines, trying to understand how Germany had achieved operational jet propulsion, while British efforts remained experimental. The conclusion was sobering. Germany had succeeded through desperation, accepting engine life expectancies of just 25 hours because that was enough for combat operations, even though it would never be acceptable for peacetime aviation. In June 1945, Air Ministry historians interviewed pilots who'd participated in anti-jet operations. Their testimonies revealed the psychological reality behind statistics. They described the terror of engaging aircraft that could accelerate away at will, the exhaustion of flying constant high-altitude patrols, the grim satisfaction when tactical patience resulted in a kill. Morrison's testimony was recorded on June 18th. You couldn't fight them conventionally, couldn't dogfight, couldn't chase. So we learned to be patient, wait for the moment when their technology didn't matter, when they were slow, distracted, committed to an attack they couldn't abort. Then hit fast and disengage before they could respond. It wasn't heroic, but it worked. The strategic lesson was profound. Technological superiority could be negated by tactical innovation, resource management, and operational discipline. Germany had achieved extraordinary engineering breakthrough, but lacked the industrial depth to exploit it. Britain had inferior technology but superior logistics, training infrastructure, and strategic patience. Post-war analysis by military theorists identified the anti-Me-262 campaign as pivotal example of asymmetric tactical response to technological disadvantage. The RAF hadn't tried to match German jets. They'd made jet performance irrelevant by refusing to fight on terms where it mattered. By late 1945, Britain was developing its own jet fighters, the Gloucester Meteor and de Havilland Vampire. But these aircraft incorporated lessons learned fighting Me-262s, reliability over raw performance, maintainability over complexity, operational practicality over theoretical superiority. Harcourt was promoted to group captain and assigned to help develop post-war RAF tactical doctrine. He spent the next 3 years writing manuals, teaching courses, ensuring that the improvised lessons of 1944-45 became institutional knowledge. Morrison returned to Liverpool in August 1945. He worked in aircraft maintenance, married his longtime girlfriend, started a family. He rarely spoke about the war. When historians interviewed him in the 1970s after Luftwaffe records were declassified and the full extent of anti-jet operations became public, he was characteristically understated. We did what needed doing. Nothing more complicated than that. Thornton remained in the RAF until 1952, eventually commanding training squadrons and advocating for expanded roles for women in military aviation. Her post-war writings emphasized the importance of adaptability. Technology changes, tactics change. What doesn't change is that wars are won by people willing to think creatively when conventional methods fail. The Me-262 entered aviation history as the first operational jet fighter, a magnificent achievement that came too late, deployed too sparingly, countered too effectively. It represented both the peak of German aeronautical engineering and the futility of technological miracles when strategic foundations had collapsed. The Spitfire pilots who'd hunted those jets represented something different, the capacity of ordinary people to confront seemingly impossible challenges through determination, improvisation, and willingness to accept brutal costs in service of victory. They'd faced the future of aerial warfare with obsolete aircraft and won through sheer tactical stubbornness. Decades later, aviation museums would display Me-262s as artifacts of revolutionary technology. But the real revolution had been simpler. Learning that speed could be negated by patience, that technological advantage could be rendered meaningless by exploitation of narrow vulnerabilities, and that wars were still won by people willing to think harder than their enemies. On a spring afternoon in 1946, Harcourt stood at Bentley Priory, now being decommissioned after serving as Fighter Command headquarters throughout the war. The operations room was empty, plotting tables abandoned, blackout curtains torn down. Through windows, sunlight fell on green Middlesex countryside. He thought about November 1944, when Me-262 reports had arrived and survival seemed impossible. Thought about the pilots who'd faced those jets and developed tactics through trial and error and loss. Thought about how Britain had done what Britain always did when facing overwhelming threat, refused to concede defeat, improvised with whatever resources existed, and ground down enemies through sheer bloody-minded persistence. The Me-262 had been faster, but speed hadn't been enough. Britain had been slower, weaker, exhausted, and victorious. That, Harcourt reflected, was perhaps the most British thing possible. If you found this story of resilience, innovation, and tactical brilliance compelling, do smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon so you never miss another untold story from the Second World War. Drop a comment below telling us what other underestimated aspects of the war would you like us to explore. Share this video with anyone who appreciates how determination and creativity can overcome even the most formidable technological advantages. Until next time, keep calm and carry on learning history.